Hi, people. So I think it would be remiss of me not to talk about this subject because it could be pivotal. It could be a very significant event, or it could also be something that peters out. And I think whichever one of those scenarios plays out, it's going to play on how this story is reported. Um, I hope it's the former, but I think given what's been happening in Iran, um, hundreds have died this year in Iran over in the Masa Amini protests. Iran's a country that has had many angry demonstrations before. It tends to be generational every 10 years, but in recent years it's just growing against that regime. So in the case of Iran, I've been quite cautious about getting too optimistic because it's just happened before, where anger has boiled over, people have taken to the streets, they've been brutally, in many cases, gunned down, literally, and then it goes back to the same old repressive regime. I think that in the case of China, therefore, there needs to be some caution over where this will lead. But it is different than normal. China, contrary to um, popular opinion, actually does have protests. It's just that they tend to be very localized, small scale, and immediately censored. So, for example, could have a dispute over land reform acts or over migrant workers. In China, you get a situation where migrant workers from rural areas go into cities. um, it's not necessarily the sort of human rights issues that raise concern in the West. So you're not going to necessarily get people in Shanghai and Beijing protesting for the rights of Uyghurs. But I think what's different this time is it's a kind of collective anger. And that's why there is analogies been drawn to 1989. Now, there's been news today that Jiang Zemin has passed away at the age of 96, former Chinese president. I've been looking at old clips of him. He was president from 1989, just after the Tiananmen events, up until 2002. And I always sort of saw Jiang as a sort of Chinese Boris Yeltsin in the sense that he presided over a very important time, a transitionary period from when China was emerging from that Tiananmen era and heavy sanctions to being a growing power. Its economy grew fast in the 1990s, even faster in the 2000s. In 1999 or 98, it joined the World Trade Organization. I've just watched clips of the Bill Clinton, Jiang Zemin joint press conferences, and of course there were differences, but very different atmosphere from today. Clearly, relations were a lot better, even with the differences on human rights. Relations were generally a lot better. Um, Relations in recent years between Beijing and the West have been an all-time low. Rishi Sunak made a historic speech the other night, historic in the sense that he has broken with a number of his predecessors and said officially that the era of Anglo-Chinese golden relations is over. This is a direct rebuke to the policies laid out by David Cameron and George Osborne, and I think the right message. I take no pleasure from it, but it is the right position to take. This was at the Mansion House speech, I believe, Sunak's first major foreign policy speech as Prime Minister. That's reassuring because there was some disquiet that Sunak was soft on China. To be fair to him, I think he has, in his brief time as Prime Minister so far, shown he's quite assertive on this. He pledged to close Confucius Institute. He made this very candid speech. The Chinese ambassador has been recalled because a BBC journalist was roughly arrested in one of the demonstrations. I don't know if it was Shanghai or Beijing. Ed Lawrence. Ironically and pathetically, the authorities claimed it was for his own good because they wanted to protect him from COVID. But what I feel is comparable to 1989 is this is not just one group of people. In 1989, one of the misconceptions about the Tiananmen protests is they were student protests. It is true that students were involved, but actually, in the event of 1989, there were a lot of ordinary people involved too, workers, housewives. It wasn't just revolutionary students. It wasn't just idealistic young students, although they certainly were very important in that movement. Um, and the victims also included, they weren't just students, they were also ordinary people and ostensibly some soldiers as well. Um, Already there's signs that the police are getting rough in Shanghai. People who've been holding those blank pieces of paper have been roughed up. They've been, a housewife was, forced to delete images on her phone. Looking at Chinese social media, I'm connected to a lot of those sites like Weibo, QQ, and so on. Not a single mention of any of this, not surprising, because they've probably been mandated from the top, do not report on this. But the thing is, if this was a localized protest in one city, it would be very easy to sort of quiet it down. But I think when people literally see this with their own eyes, when they see their neighbours taken to the streets, when they see what is happening, it's going to be harder to censor this. And I think the anger will grow. Um, so I think this is potentially a very significant situation, potentially. I think what the CCP may be banking on, they're not stupid. They're not going to just open fire immediately. There's not necessarily going to be a repeat of Tiananmen Square. Also, we live now in an era of the internet, even in an authoritarian state like China. You can't just hide stuff like that. In 1989, there was really just broadcast media and newspapers. There was no internet. There was no, at least not in the way we know it today. There was no social media. So I think the Communist Party is aware of that. They can't be too reckless here. I think they're probably banking on this just kind of running out of steam. But here's the problem, they've got themselves into a trap. Um, as I understand it, the Chinese vaccination program is okay, but it's not the best. A lot of elderly Chinese are unvaccinated. Some of their fears may actually be justified. That is, that if they immediately lift all lockdowns, there will be an enormous death rate. That may actually be true. But here's the problem. The way they're going about it is just too typical of a hardline communist state. It's simply too oppressive. I mean, people are literally trapped in their homes. They can't even access food. I mean, in Britain, when we had the lockdown, there were liberties taken away, basically, but people could go outside for essential reasons, which included getting food. Now, in China, they cannot even do that. So there may be people who are literally starving. In Guangzhou, there were angry scenes a while back. People were rioting. In Zhengzhou, people had walked out of an iPhone factory. Um, in Chengdu, people were openly calling for the end of the Communist Party. But what's remarkable about this is often with protests in China, it's about localized issues and it's anger over localized issues, perhaps anger at a corrupt official or perhaps anger at a specific issue. But I'm not sure if those localized protests involve what we're seeing now, which is people openly, defiantly calling for the removal of Xi Jinping and openly calling him a dictator. Now, this is not Hong Kong. This is the Chinese mainland. This is Shenzhen, Shanghai, Beijing, Chengdu. Um, a lot of this, of course, was triggered by one particular event, that deadly fire in Urumqi. 10 people died. And apparently a fire station was nearby, but they couldn't access it because of the strict measures that were in place. So those 10 people died unnecessarily. Um, and apparently they were weaker people, which would make sense in that part of the country. The men folk were in concentration camps and the women died. So that's Xi Jinping's legacy. Um, Now, I think we need to be a little bit cautious not to expect like a sudden revolution in the Communist Party to suddenly fall. This is a party that has built up its strength over time, and they are very, very savvy in terms of maintaining power. But these are probably the most significant protests in mainland China basically since 1989. In the early 2010s, so were again localized protests, but not on this scale. I don't think they spread to Shanghai and Beijing. Um, they were in the south, the Wuhan protests, the Wuhan village protests was quite high profile. But we're now seeing a situation where in China's major cities, Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, Wuhan, um, people are taking to the streets in a way that wasn't seen before. Now, it is true that even if there's thousands on the streets, there's probably a lot more that aren't taking to the streets. And, the typical sort of propaganda that was put out by Beijing was that false information is being spread and this is being dealt with. But I think that people aren't stupid. They will read through this, and they cannot always scapegoat the West because people are seeing this for their own eyes. So if communist propaganda is telling them this is all just American agitators, or it's just biased Western media, and they're literally seeing their neighbors going out there, that line won't work anymore. The Chinese can be pretty nationalistic and defensive, and for a long time that nationalistic card has worked. There is, of course, this was suggested on the BBC report, the death of Jiang today may be a useful distraction for the CCP because they may focus on his presidency, and um, his presidency, incidentally, was eventful. I mentioned he came in power after Tiananmen. He presided over the handover of Hong Kong, China joining the World Trade Organization. He also presided over the brutal crackdown of Falun Gong. So Falun Gong practitioners will remember Jiang as much in the way that Tiananmen survivors remember the so-called butcher of Beijing, Li Peng, who was in charge at the time. I think he was premier at that time. Um, so it could be that they use that as a distraction. I'm not so sure though. Jiang was 96 years old. He was an old man. This year, we've seen the death of Mikhail Gorbachev, Queen Elizabeth II, now Jiang Zemin. Um, they'll talk about his presidency, but ironically, it may actually also harm the party. Jiang was no reformer. He was no Gorbachev, but China was in a happier position then. It was a growing economy. There was no pandemic. Um, Today, it's got a greatly slowed down economy. Xi Jinping's authority is seriously being undermined by all of this. And people are very, very angry. So it may actually be that they look at Chang's era with nostalgia and then look at the current period. And it's sort of ironic because Xi Jinping is the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao. And for a long time, he seemed to have, an iron grip on power. But what we're seeing now, of course, is there's protests around the world in solidarity. Some of them may be, Chinese dissidents. Some of them may be people who are in solidarity with that. In Tokyo, in Brisbane, London, Hong Kong. But what is really significant is in mainland China. I mean, that's cannot be understated. To have protests with thousands of people on the street, like I say, my perception of protests in China is that they tend to be localized. They tend to be sometimes in cities, sometimes in rural areas, but they tend to be localized. What you have now is this collective sort of, there's no single organization, there's no single like democracy movement, but people have just had enough. I mean, if you treat people like prisoners, if you force them to stay in their homes and they can't access food, it's there was distressing images earlier, I think it was this year, of people in quarantine centers basically having a mental breakdown, slamming the ground in rage because they're being treated like animals. Basically, this is not like you need to stay here for your own good and we'll give you money for food. They're basically being treated like prisoners. So naturally the anger has boiled over. I asked my student about this. She's a middle-aged housewife basically in Beijing, and um, obviously, I treaded a little bit carefully because what they hear may be different from what's being reported elsewhere. But she actually said, "Yeah, that's happening." I didn't know how she would react to this being brought up, but she said, "Yeah, people are taking to the streets." Now, she's not a political person. I can't really imagine her going to the streets, and most Chinese won't. But it may well be many will actually be feeling this way. They may be feeling angry with the situation, but there is real risks. Now, just like the protests in Russia, at some point, the authorities can't simply arrest everyone. And they're certainly not going to start gunning down protesters in front of, the world media. That's not going to happen. So they may be, like they've done in Hong Kong, they may be more subtle about it. They may find other methods to try and intimidate people, perhaps get to their family members. They have the technology to find people's faces and so on. So those people openly calling for the removal of Xi Jinping, that takes significant courage. I noticed that in the Brisbane protests, there were some Chinese guys who were filming the protesters, and Drew Pavlo, who is a prominent human rights activist and Beijing critic, he confronted them and he said, guys, what are you doing? And they said, we're just here. It's an open space. We're here to see what's going on. He suspected that they were basically informants, that they were going to take pictures of people to send to the authorities, the Chinese embassy, and get to their families back home. I'm going to round this up because, this is an ongoing situation. I may turn on the news on the hour and there's even more developments. But I just think it's significant that this is not localized. This seems to be nationwide. It's in Shanghai, Beijing, Chengdu, Zhengzhou, Guangzhou. Some of it is getting quite angry. There's been clashes between those guys in the hazmat suits, and basically residents who are fed up of being treated like animals in a zoo. I mean, if I think if Xi Jinping gets too hard line, I think the anger may blow up to such an extent that his power really does come unravel. Because the big banking shift that the CCP has had up to date is, will the people will kind of remain obedient as long as the economy is stable. So as long as people are relatively comfortable, and that, to be honest, is one reason the CCP has survived as long as it has, because quite honestly, the average Chinese citizen is not a human rights ideologue. They're not going to be spending a lot of time thinking about those things. They're more interested in just bread and butter issues, the cost of living, same as we feel in the UK, the same as issues anywhere. And the Chinese economy had been, very strong for a long time, but it's finally starting to face serious weaknesses. So this may be the beginning of the end of Xi Jinping. Of course, he has just promoted himself to an unlimited time and power at the latest People's Congress. There were significant events at that. The circumstances around Hu Jintao being removed. I mean, they said it was for his health. He's 79 years old. They said he was confused and he just was escorted out for his own health. He looked, based on that footage, it looked like he was reluctant to go. So, given the history of the Chinese Communist Party, it's very plausible that there are internal power struggles. The late Jiang, he had a whole faction in the CCP. So it may be that Xi Jinping's faction is finally starting to face discontent from within. Um, and it may be that some of the hardliners, maybe former PLA generals, maybe some of the more veteran party members, they saw Xi as a stabilizing force, a strong leader, and they said, okay, you strengthened China, you stood up to the United States, the economy is growing. But the worst thing for any dictator is to see their own hench people, their own circle, see them as weak. And that's when they're potentially most dangerous. But I think, like I say, if they take the same approach that they took in 1989, the international condemnation will be fierce. I think China will face massive sanctions, just as Russia did after its invasion of Ukraine. The Russian economy is finally starting to feel the weight of that. Um, but at the same time, outsiders need to be a little bit cautious just to assume that, oh, well, the people are rising up. It's the end of the CCP. This is a regime that survived for 70 years. They've got, oceans of blood on their hands. They've survived before, so they could potentially survive again. I think the worst potential situation here is that the willpower of the people kind of just phases out and people kind of give up and they think it's not worth it. So it's going to take an enormous amount of courage and energy, I think, to keep up this momentum. What can she do? He can ease the lockdown measures, or at least provide. If they really do insist that this is about protecting people, at least give people the means to live as human beings. Give them food, give them exercise, give them some means to live as human beings. Because what they're seeing is, when they're watching the Qatar World Cup, they're seeing other people, apparently they've pixeled out, other people not wearing masks. I told my student the lockdown ended here a year ago. Life in Britain now, in that sense, is pretty much back to normal. So I think Chinese citizens will look around the world and think, why are we still in this situation? And it will be a combination of these things that will mean anger will potentially grow. There may well be nationalistic forces who rally in defense of the CCP, but this isn't a case of some feud with the United States. This is an internal issue. So it's harder for them to just say, oh, well, it's American agitators, because people will say, BS. We could see with our own eyes that's not the case. So it's a situation that definitely warrants, a close look. I mean, I think the CCP is. I would like to see the end of it. I would like to see a much brighter future in China that is more open, more democratic. These things don't happen overnight. I'm not talking about Western style democracy necessarily, but under Xi Jinping, it has only got more totalitarian, more brutal. If there could be some sort of reversal of that, that's a good thing. I don't think the CCP is going to disappear overnight, but this could be the beginning of the end. Who knows? Who knows? It's definitely a situation that I'll be watching very closely.